Kaisauta ran a session called Notebook Primer for No-Code, Low-Code Devs, and the title sounds harmless, helpful even, but it drags an uncomfortable leadership question into the room. What happens when the organization can't explain the systems it depends on? Not what tool should we use, but can we scale decision-making without losing clarity, control, and accountability? Because speed is easy to celebrate, governance is harder to celebrate, and the gap between them is where executives inherit risk they didn't knowingly approve. The foundational misunderstanding: fast isn't scalable. Most organizations treat fast as a strategy. They are wrong. Fast is a local optimization. It wins in a single team, a single project, a single quarter. Scale is different. Scale is system behavior across time, across people, across changes you didn't anticipate, and across failures you didn't budget for. That distinction matters because leadership doesn't get to govern a flow. Leadership governs the accumulation, the growing pile of automations, connectors, identities, and exceptions that quietly becomes business-critical infrastructure. Low-code is not the villain here. Abstraction is. Low-code tools trade explicit intent for implicit outcomes. They take something you could read: logic, dependencies, conditions, error handling, data transformations, and they turn it into a set of configured behaviors that work until you need to prove why they worked, or change them safely, or defend them in an audit. And this is where the foundational misunderstanding shows up. Leaders see delivery velocity and assume they are buying scalability. They aren't. They are buying throughput in the build phase and often paying for it later in governance, incident response, and rework. Digital transformation gets misread as automation volume. More flows, more apps, more approvals routed, more data moved, more dashboards shipped. But the actual value of transformation is decision quality. Can the organization make decisions reliably, consistently, and defensibly as complexity grows? If the answer is no, then automation is just faster confusion. Executives tend to get reports that are optimized for comfort: adoption counts, run counts, time saved, and green check marks, output metrics. They don't get what actually matters at scale: decision pathways. A decision pathway is the chain of logic and data movement that explains how an outcome happened, what triggered it, what rules applied, what data was read, what changed it, what got skipped, what failed and retried, who modified it, when, under what permissions, with what exception, with what impact. That's explainability. Not as a philosophical concept, as an executive control requirement. Explainability at leadership level means traceability. The ability to point at an outcome and say, with evidence, this is how we got here. Not, I think this is what the flow does. Not the original builder left it. Not, it's probably this connector. The evidence, deterministic answers. Because once the organization can't explain its automations, it can't govern them. And once it can't govern them, it can't safely scale them. Here's the trade nobody says out loud. Abstraction compresses complexity during creation, but it expands complexity during ownership. In the build phase, abstraction hides details. That feels like progress. In the operating phase, hidden details become unknowns. Unknowns become risk. Risk becomes executive cost. This is why fast isn't scalable is not a slogan. It is a system law. Scale creates drift. People leave. Teams reorganize. Naming conventions decay. Permissions expand. Exceptions get introduced just this once. And the problem isn't that any of this happens. The problem is that low-code environments often make drift invisible. They don't force intent to stay explicit. They don't force you to write down assumptions. They don't force you to model data transformations in a way that's readable to people who weren't there when it was built. So the organization ends up with a deterministic belief and a probabilistic reality. It believes we have controls. It actually has. We have controls, and every except is an entropy generator. Entropy here isn't poetic. It's operational. It's the gradual erosion of clarity that turns a system from governable to mysterious. Each exception creates a new pathway that must be remembered, defended, and revisited. But it won't be revisited. That's the point. Leaders don't have time to chase every exception, which means the system will accumulate them until nobody is confident enough to change anything. And at that moment, the organization stops scaling. It just keeps running until an audit, an incident, or a strategic change forces it to explain itself. That's when the bill arrives. This is the uncomfortable shift. Scalability isn't about how fast you can build. It's about how safely you can change. It's about whether your operating model can keep up with your delivery model. If understanding lags behind delivery, risk doesn't stay operational. It becomes structural, and structural risk doesn't land on the builder. It lands on leadership. Now, there are platforms designed to do the opposite of what low-code abstraction tends to do. They surface intent instead of hiding it. They make logic inspectable, reviewable, reproducible. We'll get to that. But first, the organization has to admit the real failure mode. Not that low-code can't build powerful things, but that fast creates executive blind spots, and blind spots scale perfectly. When tools outpace understanding, governance becomes a rumor. Governance doesn't fail in a meeting. It fails in the gap between what was built and what can be explained. Low-code accelerates delivery, so the organization starts shipping automations faster than it can absorb them, faster than it can review them, faster than it can document them, faster than it can train people to support them, and definitely faster than it can retire them. And that creates a predictable pattern. The organization can't explain the thing, therefore it can't safely change the thing, therefore it starts protecting the thing. That's how we can't explain it turns into we can't touch it. Under pressure, an incident, a deadline, a reorg, people don't have time for archaeology. So they do what humans always do. They root around the unknown. They add another flow, another patch, another exception, another connector, another conditional branch that only one person understands. And those patches don't reduce risk, they manufacture it. This is the uncomfortable truth. Accountability requires explainability. If you can't show the logic, you can't prove control. If you can't prove control, you are not governing a system. You're telling stories about it, confidently in slide decks with the volume turned up. That distinction matters because leadership is the default risk owner. Executives don't get to say, I didn't approve that flow, when the outcome lands in front of the board, the regulator, or the customer. The system doesn't care who clicked save. It cares what ran, what data moved, and what decision it produced. So the executive risk isn't a citizen developer made a mistake. The executive risk is that the organization created a decision engine it can't interrogate. And once that happens, governance becomes a rumor. Everyone assumes someone else is handling it. There's a policy somewhere, there's a COE, there's a platform team, there's a checklist, there's a DLP rule, there's a tenant setting. But when you ask a simple question, show me how this works end to end, nobody can produce a single, coherent, evidence-backed answer. Instead, you get fragments. The flow is owned by finance. The connector was set up by someone in ops. The data comes from a SharePoint list. There's also an Excel file involved, and there's a Power BI report that depends on it. And the vendor system changed last month, and it still works mostly. That's not governance, that's oral tradition. And oral tradition doesn't scale. Here's what most people miss. Low code doesn't remove complexity, it relocates it. It moves complexity from the build surface, where engineers and architects are trained to see it, into the runtime surface, where it hides inside configuration, identity permissions, connector behavior, and silent assumptions. So when the tool outpaces understanding, the organization starts inheriting risk in three forms. First, operational risk. Things fail and diagnosis takes too long because the system is opaque. Second, compliance risk. Audits don't accept it usually does this. They accept evidence. Third, strategic risk. The organization becomes slower at change because nobody wants to touch the fragile unknown. This is why leaders need a different mental model. Low code isn't a product category, it's an abstraction model. And abstraction models have a known failure mode. They make the early stage easier and the later stage harder. The later stage is the one executives live in. The later stage is ownership, change, control, defense. Which brings us back to that hint from earlier. There are governed execution models that force intent to stay visible. They make change a reviewable event, not an invisible tweak. They make logic readable to the institution, not just to the original builder. They don't eliminate speed, they eliminate untraceable speed. Because the real enemy isn't automation, it's automation you can't defend. So when leadership hears governance, it shouldn't think more documentation. Documentation is optional, it's a best effort artifact. It goes stale the moment reality changes. Governance is enforcement of intent by design. If the system doesn't force clarity, you will not get clarity. You will get drift, you will get exceptions, you will get conditional chaos, and you will eventually get the moment where someone says out loud in a room that matters, we can't explain how this decision was made. That's the line where governance stops being an IT topic. It becomes a leadership problem. Next, the foundational mistake behind most of these failures, treating low code as simplicity when it's really just complexity in a different costume. Low code isn't simplicity, it's abstraction debt. Low code is sold as simplicity. And at the point of creation, it often feels like it. Drag a connector, add a condition, route an approval, map a column, schedule it, done. But the system didn't become simple, it became abstract. And abstraction has a cost that always shows up later, when the organization needs institutional understanding instead of individual memory. Here's the difference. Leadership needs to internalize. Low code reduces build friction, not outcome complexity. The outcome still has dependencies. It still has data movement. It still has identities and permissions. It still has error handling, whether you modeled it or not. It still has retry logic, whether you can see it or not. It still has timeouts, throttling, connector quirks, API changes, schema drift, and 100 other realities that don't disappear just because the UI looks friendly. Low code often just moves those realities out of sight. That is not simplification. That is deferred complexity. And deferred complexity becomes debt, not technical debt in the cliché sense, something more specific and much more corrosive to leadership. Abstraction debt. Abstraction debt is what happens when the institution can no longer read its own decision logic. A low-code flow can be perfectly readable to the person who built it. It is rarely readable to an organization. It's a private language, a visual dialect of branching logic, connector configuration, and implicit assumptions. The moment the original builder leaves, or changes roles, or just forgets why they did something 6 months ago, the explanation starts to evaporate. The automation keeps running. The explanation doesn't. That gap is what I'm calling visual logic debt. The outcomes persist, but the reasoning disappears. And visual logic debt scales quietly because it looks harmless at first. A small automation here, a helper flow there, a quick workaround during a busy week, and each one of those is rational in isolation. But systems don't fail in isolation, they fail in accumulation. The foundational mistake is treating more abstraction as more governance-friendly. It's usually the reverse. Abstraction tends to replace explicit inspectable logic with configured behavior that's spread across the flow itself, the connector and its permissions, the data source, the downstream consumers, and the identities that can modify any of it. So when someone asks, what exactly decides whether this record gets approved, the answer is rarely one thing. It's a graph of things, and the graph is not visible in one place. This is where the term entropy generator matters, once and only once. An entropy generator is anything that increases future ambiguity faster than the organization can reduce it. In low-code environments, the most common entropy generators are exceptions. Just bypass this step for the CFO. Just run it as my account for now. Just hardcode this value until the vendor fixes their API. Just add another branch for the holiday schedule. Each exception produces a new pathway. That pathway becomes part of the operating system of the business. It will be used again, it will be forgotten, and the next person will add another exception on top of it because the easiest thing to do in an opaque system is to route around it. That's how deterministic intent becomes probabilistic governance. Here's the one-sentence definition leaders need. Probabilistic governance is when controls exist, but outcomes depend on luck and undocumented exceptions. Everything looks governed on paper. In reality, it's conditional chaos. And the scaling pattern is boring, predictable, and brutal. More flows means more connectors. More connectors means more credentials. More credentials means more permission drift. More permission drift means more unreviewed change pathways. And more change pathways means ownership dissolves into whoever can still log in. At that point, who approved this? Well, it turns into who remembers this. And that's the leadership problem, because auditability doesn't collapse because the organization made one bad decision. It collapses because the organization created thousands of small, untraceable decisions over time, and then tried to pretend they were still one coherent system. So low-code isn't the problem. The problem is letting abstraction become the default execution model for mission-critical decisions, because when the logic is not inspectable, the organization can't prove control, and when it can't prove control, governance becomes performance art. Next, the first failure mode, leaders always meet in the real world. Auditability collapses. Risk 1, loss of auditability. Auditability is not, we can explain it in a meeting. Auditability is you can produce evidence, not vibes, not institutional confidence, not a senior person saying, yeah, that's how it works. Evidence-backed explanation. And the moment an organization scales low-code as an execution model for important decisions, auditability becomes the first casualty. Because low-code doesn't typically create one clean, inspectable chain of logic. It creates a scatter plot, logic in the flow, logic in the connector, logic in the identity that owns the connection, logic in the data source's permissions, logic in this one shared mailbox nobody remembers setting up. And over time, the execution trail fragments across products, tenants, personal accounts, and temporary workspaces that quietly became permanent. That's not an accident, it's system behavior. Low code makes it easy to build. It also makes it easy to build in the wrong place, with the wrong identity, under the wrong ownership model, because the system doesn't force you to declare intent in a way auditors recognize as control. So when the audit shows up, the question is never, does the automation work? Auditors don't care that it worked last quarter. The audit question is, show me the logic. Show me what triggers it, what conditions apply, what data it reads, what it writes, and who can change any of that. Then show me who approved the changes. Then show me how you know it didn't drift. And this is where low-code sprawl turns leaders into storytellers, because the organization can usually describe what the automation does, but it can't consistently prove how it does it. And describe is not a control. Description is an opinion, a guess, a memory. Audits don't accept that. Incidents don't accept that. Regulators definitely don't accept that. Here's the failure pattern executives should recognize. Ownership dissolves before the system becomes business critical. In early stages, the builder is the owner. Later, the builder changes roles. Then the team changes. Then the process becomes embedded. And suddenly, nobody owns the logic. People only own the outcome. So when an auditor asks, who approved this decision rule? The answer becomes, approved? It evolved. That is not the answer you want to give in a room with legal present. And the weird part is, leadership often thinks auditability is a documentation problem. It isn't. Documentation is optional. It's a parallel narrative that may or may not match reality. Auditability is an architecture problem. It is the difference between a system that records decision pathways by design versus a system where you have to reconstruct those pathways after the fact. After the fact is expensive. After the fact is political. After the fact is when people defend tools instead of defending controls. Because once a system is opaque, the organization starts relying on trust in individuals instead of trust in evidence. And individuals are not a governance model. This is where the cost becomes very real. First, remediation churn. You don't fix the issue once. You chase it across flows, connectors, and related automations that were never formally related until the audit made them related. Second, delayed releases. Because under audit pressure, every change becomes risky. Nobody wants to touch the mystery machine. Third, leadership credibility damage. Because the organization ends up saying, in essence, we can't show our work. And when you can't show your work, you don't look fast. You look reckless. Now connect this to the executive calendar because that's where this becomes inevitable. Audits force visibility. Incidents force speed. Both punish opacity. In an audit, you have time, but you must prove control. In an incident, you have no time and you must change safely. Low-code sprawl tends to fail both tests for the same reason. It's hard to produce a single authoritative view of logic and change history. So executives end up funding two parallel efforts, the team that keeps things running and the team that explains what's running. That second team is just security debt with a headcount plan, and the most important leadership question becomes brutally simple. Do you want to pay for explainability as part of the design, or do you want to pay for explainability as an emergency service? Because low-code doesn't remove audit work, it postpones it. And postponed audit work always returns with interest. Next, once auditability collapses, data lineage follows, and then accountability becomes a guessing game. Risk 2, broken data lineage and evaporating accountability. Once auditability collapses, data lineage is the next thing to die. And leadership usually doesn't notice until the organization is in a room full of expensive people asking a cheap question. Where did this number come from? Lineage is the ability to trace a piece of data from origin to outcome. What system produced it, what transformations touched it, what rules changed it, and where it ended up. That sounds like a data team concern. It isn't. At leadership level, lineage is how you defend decisions. It's how you defend spend. It's how you defend outcomes when a regulator, a customer, or your own board asks you to prove that your reporting isn't just optimistic fiction. Low-code sprawl breaks lineage in a very specific way. It turns transformations into invisible behavior. A field gets renamed somewhere. A filter gets applied in that one flow. A join happens in Power Query. A calculation gets adjusted in the app. And because each of those steps happens inside a different visual surface owned by a different person under different permissions, the institution never gets a single authoritative chain of custody. You don't have lineage, you have folklore. And the moment you have folklore, accountability starts to evaporate. Not because people are lazy, but because the system stopped producing a clear ownership model. Ownership isn't a badge, it's a control. Ownership means someone is responsible for the logic, not just the outcome. Someone can approve changes. Someone can roll back changes. Someone can explain changes. Low code makes it easy to create outcomes without creating ownership. The thing runs, the request is closed, the business is happy, and then the logic quietly becomes part of production. But when something breaks, the organization learns the difference between shared responsibility and no responsibility. Here's what that looks like in an incident. A number in a report is wrong, not obviously wrong. Wrong enough to matter, but not wrong enough to trigger a monitoring alert. Someone spots it because a customer complains, or because finance sees a mismatch, or because a leader asks why a KPI moved in the wrong direction. Now, the organization has to answer 3 questions fast. What changed? Where did it change? Who changed it? In a governed system, those are unpleasant questions, but they're answerable. In low-code sprawl, they become archaeology. Because the data might have flowed through a pipeline, then a data flow, then a spreadsheet, then a semantic model, then a report, then an email automation that helpfully cached the old values in a SharePoint list. That's not a hypothetical. That's what flexibility looks like after 6 months of success. And when lineage is broken, incident response stops being engineering and becomes negotiation. Teams argue about boundaries. It's not our data set. It's not our flow. We only consume the output. We didn't change anything. Which is usually true because the change happened in the crack between tools. And that crack is where low-code hides impact. This is why evaporating accountability is not a culture problem. It's an architecture problem. The organization built a system where the logic is distributed, the change surface is everywhere, and the blast radius is unclear. So when leadership asks, who owns this? The only honest answer is, nobody owns it end to end. They own pieces, they own screens, they own tasks, they own a step in the chain. But the chain itself is unowned. And the chain is the system. That's the leadership risk. When lineage breaks, reliability becomes guesswork. because you can't validate what you can't trace. You can't confidently certify a report. You can't confidently approve a change. You can't confidently say that a decision was made on correct data. You can only say it didn't fail loudly. And it didn't fail loudly is not a governance standard. So here's the practical translation for leaders. Lineage is not documentation. It is the mechanism that turns decision-making into something defensible. If you can't show where data came from and how it changed, you are not running an analytics program. You are running a belief system. And belief systems collapse under scrutiny. Next, the third risk is where executives get surprised. Operational fragility. Because systems don't have to be wrong to be dangerous. They just have to be brittle. Risk 3. Operational fragility at scale. Operational fragility is the one that blindsides leadership because it doesn't announce itself as a governance issue. It shows up as random failures. A run that used to finish by 6 a.m. now finishes at 9. A report refresh occasionally times out. A load completes, but the numbers are off by just enough to start arguments. A connector rate limits on the worst possible day. And because low-code tends to hide the mechanics, the organization mislabels these as bugs instead of what they really are, brittle assumptions meeting scale. Low-code succeeds early because the world is still small. The data volume is manageable. The schema hasn't drifted. The dependencies are few. The original builder is still around. And the business exceptions haven't been discovered yet. Then growth happens. And growth is not gentle. Volume increases first. More records, more files, more API calls, more retries. You start bumping into throttling, timeouts, and service limits you didn't even know existed because the platform absorbed them quietly until it couldn't. Schema drift comes next. A vendor adds a column. A source system changes a data type. Someone fixes a SharePoint list. Suddenly, a transformation step that relied on implicit structure starts behaving differently. Not always failing, sometimes succeeding with degraded output. Dependency multiplication is the real killer. People don't usually build one flow that does everything. They build a flow that triggers another flow, that writes to a list, that triggers a report, that triggers an email. It's modular, which sounds responsible until nobody can see the dependency graph. Then modular becomes opaque. So at scale, reliability in low-code environments often inverts. The system looks stable right up to the moment it isn't, because the platform makes failure modes easy to miss. Partial loads, silent truncation, skipped rows, successful runs with warnings nobody reads, retries that create duplicates, or compensating logic that hides the problem until a downstream consumer notices. This is the uncomfortable part. Low code often fails like a spreadsheet fails, not with an explosion, with quiet wrongness. And quiet wrongness is worse than downtime. Downtime triggers escalation. Quiet wrongness triggers bad decisions. Now connect this back to leadership cost, because this is where cheap automation turns expensive. When systems are fragile, change cycles slow down. Every modification becomes risky because nobody can predict the blast radius. So the organization starts introducing process friction to compensate for architectural uncertainty. More approvals, more CAB meetings, more don't touch it during quarter end, more shadow environments, more manual checks. That's not maturity. That's insurance. And it's expensive. The incident response pattern becomes predictable. Diagnosis turns into archaeology, remediation turns into patchwork, and prevention turns into add another check. Over time, the organization spends more time defending brittle automations than improving the business. This is where the term from earlier matters again, and it needs a clean definition. Probabilistic governance is when controls exist, but outcomes depend on luck and undocumented exceptions. In a deterministic model, leadership can say, if we implement these controls, the system behaves this way. In a probabilistic model, leadership is stuck saying, we have controls, but sometimes the connector throttles, sometimes the schema changes, sometimes it drops rows, sometimes someone updated the logic in a hurry, sometimes the flow ran under a different identity, sometimes it's not a strategy. And the most corrosive part is that fragility hides behind success metrics. 1,000 runs completed, 99% succeeded, green dashboards. Then one run fails at the wrong time with the wrong dependency chain, and suddenly the organization is treating an automation as a production system without production-grade observability. So leaders end up paying twice, once for the convenience of abstraction and again for the operational overhead required to keep abstraction from collapsing under growth. This is why operational fragility isn't an IT complaint, it's an executive liability. Because when systems behave unpredictably, leadership can't confidently commit to timelines, can't confidently trust KPIs, and can't confidently defend outcomes. The organization becomes hesitant, not because people lack skill, but because the system has trained them that change causes surprises. And that's the point where scale stops feeling like growth. It starts feeling like exposure. Next, there's one story executives recognize instantly because it's always framed as a success, right up until it isn't. Anchor story. The Excel to low-code win that collapsed at scale. This story always starts as a win, which is why it's dangerous. A team has an Excel monster. Everyone knows it. The workbook has tabs nobody understands, Macros written by someone who left years ago, and a little note in a cell that says, "Don't change this." It's the classic, business critical, undocumented, and held together by habit, so someone fixes it. They build a low-code solution, a simple intake form, an approval flow, and an automated update into a shared list that feeds a report. The department stops emailing spreadsheets around. The process is faster. Errors drop. People celebrate. Leadership hears time saved and visibility improved, and that's the end of the story. For a while. Then adoption happens. The first request comes in. Can we add one more field? Sure, another connector, another condition. Then, can we route approvals differently for region A? Sure, another branch. Then, can we include data from that other system? Sure, another integration, another identity, another permission boundary. And because low code makes each change feel small, nobody treats these as architectural decisions. They're just tweaks. Just one more becomes the operating model. This is the critical moment leaders miss. The solution didn't scale because it was designed to scale. It scaled because the organization depended on it. The department starts relying on it daily. Other teams copy it. A second flow appears for the same process, but slightly different. The report becomes the source of truth in meetings. Soon, the workflow isn't a department tool, it's business infrastructure. And infrastructure has a different standard. Now the change request arrives that forces reality to show itself. It's always something ordinary. A new compliance requirement, a new business rule, a reorg, an acquisition, a data retention policy, something that should be a controlled update. But nobody can safely change the logic, not because the platform can't, because the organization can't. The original builder moved on. The flow was edited by 3 different people over a year. Some steps run under service accounts, some under personal connections, the approvals reference groups that were renamed. The data mapping assumes a schema that no longer exists. The error handling is whatever the default was, plus a few send an email to this mailbox patches, and that mailbox is now owned by nobody. So the team does what teams do when they inherit a fragile machine. They stop touching it. They start working around it. They export the data and fix it in Excel again just to get through month end. They add a manual check. They create a second flow to clean up failures. They add another list to store intermediate values. Each workaround reduces today's pain and increases tomorrow's opacity. And then the incident happens, not a dramatic explosion, a quiet failure. A subset of records didn't update, or approvals routed incorrectly, or an integration throttled and half the dataset got skipped. The report looks fine at first glance until someone reconciles numbers and realizes it isn't. Now leadership asks the question that always sounds simple and is never simple in these systems. What changed? And the room goes quiet because the answer is not a single change. It's a chain of changes made over time by different people across different components without a single authoritative record of intent. So incident response becomes archaeology. People dig through run histories. They search through flows. They check connector configurations. They compare screenshots. They try to reconstruct logic from a visual surface that wasn't built to be read like a system of record. And while they dig, the business keeps running, which means leadership gets the second, more expensive question. Can we fix it without breaking something else? That's where the collapse becomes visible. Because when nobody can confidently predict the blast radius, the organization is no longer operating a system. It's operating a superstition. Don't touch it, it might break. And then the third question arrives, the one that turns this from an IT annoyance into a leadership event. Can we prove the decision logic to an auditor? Not can we explain it verbally. Prove it with evidence end to end. And the honest answer is not quickly, maybe not at all. So the organization pays for the win twice. Once in build speed and again in emergency reconstruction of intent. That's the real failure mode, not capability, explainability. It worked last quarter is not an operating model. It is a warning sign that the system is being measured by outputs instead of defended by logic. And that's why this story matters. It's not about low code being bad. It's about success turning into dependency before governance catches up. The system didn't fail because it was weak. It failed because nobody could see it clearly enough to change it safely. Recognition 1. The audit that exposed visual logic debt. Audits don't arrive because the business feels like being disciplined. They arrive because someone external demands proof. And low-code environments are usually optimized for shipping outcomes, not for producing proof on demand. So the audit begins like it always does, a request for evidence. Not a request for a confident explanation, but for artifacts. What controls exist, what decisions are automated, who can change them, what changed, when and why, how you know the output is correct. And that's where visual logic debt stops being a clever phrase and becomes a budget line. Because the moment a regulator, an internal audit function, or even a customer's due diligence team asks, show me how this decision is made, you discover what you actually built. Dozens of automations with logic scattered across flows, connectors, environments, and identities. Nobody can point to a single source of truth, so the organization does what it always does under audit pressure. It tries to reconstruct intent after the fact. Someone opens flow after flow and narrates what they think it does. Someone screenshots configurations. Someone exports run histories. Someone makes a spreadsheet of critical automations that didn't exist last week. Someone tries to figure out which service accounts are still active. Someone discovers that a key connector was created under a personal account and now the person is on leave. And suddenly the audit isn't about compliance. It's about explainability. The weird part is that the teams involved often don't feel negligent. They feel attacked because from their perspective, they delivered. The process works, the business likes it, the automation runs, there's a report. So instead of defending outcomes, the organization starts defending tools. It's in Power Automate, it's secure. It's in the tenant, it's governed. We have DLP policies. We have a center of excellence. All of that can be true and still irrelevant because an audit doesn't care what platform you used. It cares whether the decision logic is inspectable and whether the control model is real. It asks boring questions because boring questions expose architectural reality. Where is the logic written down in a way that can be reviewed? Where is the approval history? Where is the version history? Where is the evidence that this decision pathway is the same today as it was last quarter? Who can modify it without telling anyone? What other processes depend on it? If those questions can't be answered quickly and consistently, governance becomes political. Not because people are malicious, but because in an opaque system, every gap becomes a debate. Teams argue over ownership boundaries. People blame shadow AT. Others blame slow it. Everyone agrees it's important, and nobody can produce an authoritative map of what actually exists. This is the point where leadership learns a brutal rule. Compliance arrives late, but invoices early. Even if the organization passes the audit, it pays in remediation, emergency documentation, rushed controls, access cleanups, and rebuilds done under deadline. Releases get delayed because nobody wants to change anything while the auditors are watching. People who should be building new capability get reassigned to proving old capability. And the longer the low-code estate has been allowed to grow without explicit inspectable intent, the worse this gets. Because you're not fixing one automation, you're unwinding a pattern. So here's the recognition executives need to internalize. Treat explainability as a control, not as documentation. Documentation is a side effect. A control is a requirement. A control is something the system enforces continuously, whether people remember or not. If the platform doesn't force logic to be reviewable, changes to be traceable, and execution to be auditable, then leadership is not buying automation. Leadership is buying future narrative work. And narrative work is what happens when evidence is missing. Recognition 2, the holiday failure pattern. The holiday failure pattern is the one everyone has seen and almost nobody treats as a governance problem. It shows up the same way every year. Easter, year-end, fiscal close, Black Friday, whatever your business calls not a normal week. Something fails, or worse, something succeeds and produces nonsense. Then the organization spends 2 days doing manual corrections while insisting it's just bad luck. It isn't. It's design debt that only becomes visible when the calendar stops cooperating. The mechanics are boring. That's why they're dangerous. A low-code automation gets built during normal conditions. The builder tests it on normal weeks. The business validates it on normal weeks. Everyone signs off because it ran twice and their output matched expectations. But the business does not operate in normal weeks. Holidays introduce exceptions that are real business rules. Offices closed, cut-off times shift, batch files don't arrive, upstream systems pause, support staffing changes, vendors run reduced schedules, and time zones suddenly matter because approvals sit longer. Those are not edge cases, those are recurring operating conditions. And low-code environments tend to hide assumptions instead of surfacing them. A flow that runs every weekday assumes weekdays always produce input. A pipeline that expects a file by 2 a.m. assumes the file always arrives. An approval step assumes someone is online to click a button within a time window. A data transformation assumes the schema stays consistent. A quick filter assumes no data means failure, not holiday. So Easter hits, and the system behaves exactly as designed, but not as intended. The input is missing because the business wasn't running, the flow retreats. Or it fails and sends a notification nobody sees because the on-call rotation wasn't defined for a citizen-built automation. Or it writes partial data because it doesn't treat incompleteness as a hard error. And then the report refreshes and leadership sees a number that looks wrong, but plausibly wrong. That is the nightmare scenario, plausible wrongness. Now you get the usual postmortem, except it's not a postmortem, it's an excuse factory. The vendor didn't deliver the file. SharePoint was slow. The API throttled. The connector had an outage. Sure, sometimes. But the real issue is that the system embedded normal weak assumptions as implicit behavior and nobody ever made those assumptions explicit enough to review. This is where explainability becomes practical, not philosophical. If the logic is inspectable, exceptions become first class. You can see the assumption in the code or the workflow. If no file arrives by 2 a.m., treat as expected on holidays, alert otherwise. You can version that assumption, review it, test it, change it. If the logic is not inspectable, the assumption is just there. hiding, waiting for the next calendar anomaly to trigger it. And the organization will keep paying the tax. Every holiday becomes a fire drill. Every year-end becomes a hands-on week. Every fiscal close becomes a fragile dance around automations nobody wants to touch. This is why resilience isn't something you get by buying more automation. Resilience is designed. It is the deliberate modeling of exceptions, the deliberate encoding of business reality, and the deliberate creation of evidence trails so that when something deviates, the organization can answer fast. What happened, why, and what to change. Low-code can absolutely handle exceptions, but low-code cultures often don't. They treat exceptions as we'll patch it when it happens because the tool makes patching easy. And easy patching is how you accumulate invisible rules that never get reviewed. So the leadership takeaway is simple. If your automations only work during normal weeks, you don't have an operating model. You have a demo that got promoted. And if you hear it always breaks around Easter, that's not a seasonal glitch. That's your governance model telling you it can't see its own assumptions. Recognition 3. The vendor exit crisis. The vendor exit crisis is the one leaders never budget for because it doesn't look like a crisis until procurement asks a simple question: how hard would it be to leave? And in low-code heavy organizations, the uncomfortable answer is, you can export the data, but you can't export the intent. That distinction matters. Most executives think lock-in is a licensing problem. Price increases, contract terms, renewal leverage. Annoying but solvable. What they miss is that the real lock-in isn't the platform. It's the decision logic you encoded inside the platform's abstraction layer. Once critical workflows live inside proprietary visual logic, the organization isn't just using a tool. It has outsourced readability. So when strategy shifts, merger, divestiture, security posture change, cloud consolidation, new regulatory requirements, the migration isn't move workloads. It's reconstruct what the organization meant. That is not a data movement project. It's an intent reconstruction project. And intent reconstruction is expensive because it's archaeology under pressure. You're not rewriting code you can read. You're reverse engineering configured behavior that evolved through exceptions, patches, and convenience. This is the moment leadership learns what portability actually means. Portability is not, can we export a file? And portability is, can another team on another platform understand and reproduce the same decisions with the same evidence trail? If the answer is no, you're not locked into technology. You're locked into opacity. And opacity is not something you can negotiate away in a contract. Here's how it plays out in real organizations. A low-code platform becomes the default delivery engine because it ships fast. Teams build dozens, then hundreds of automations. Each one solves a real problem. Each one adds a dependency. Then one day the organization needs to move. Not because the platform failed, but because the business changed. Now a leadership team asks for an exit plan and gets a spreadsheet that is basically a confession. We don't know what we have. Not fully. They know the obvious automations. They don't know the indirect ones. They don't know what depends on what. They don't know which flows contain business-critical decision rules versus nice-to-have convenience. And they definitely don't know where the undocumented exceptions are hiding. So the organization starts with inventory, and inventory immediately turns political. Teams underreport because they don't want scrutiny. Other teams overreport because they want funding. Some assets are owned by individuals, not teams. Some are running under identities nobody can transfer cleanly. Some have temporary connectors to systems that no longer exist. And in the middle of that chaos, leadership learns the actual cost center of vendor exit. Not infrastructure, but ambiguity. Because every unclear workflow requires humans to sit down and answer the same brutal question. What does this actually do and why? That's not a migration task. That's a governance failure finally becoming visible. And it shows up as a budget line in the worst way. Emergency engineering, delayed strategic change, and months of risk acceptance because the business can't stop running while you decipher the machine. This is why explainability and portability are the same conversation. If logic is explicit, readable, reviewable, versioned, you can move it. You can replatform it, you can refactor it, you can validate it. If logic is implicit, hidden in visual configuration and connector behavior, you can't move it without rebuilding the meaning from scratch. And rebuilding meaning is slow. It's also dangerous because when you rebuild meaning under deadline, you create defects that don't look like defects. They look like slightly different decisions. So the vendor exit crisis isn't a procurement story. It's a governance story. The leadership framing is simple. Exit readiness is not a licensing competency. It is an organizational capability to keep intent legible. And that capability doesn't happen accidentally. It has to be enforced by design. So the question becomes, what restores speed without manufacturing chaos? That's where notebooks finally enter the conversation, not as more code, but as the mechanism that keeps decisions readable when the business inevitably changes. Why notebooks matter, not as code, as governance. So here's the pivot. Notebooks are not the pro-code option. That framing is lazy and it misses why leadership should care. Notebooks matter because they change what the organization can prove. They make intent explicit and they make change observable. And once logic is explicit and change is observable, governance stops being a rumor and starts being a system behavior. The simplest way to say it is this. Notebooks are documentation that executes, not documentation you write later when you remember, not documentation you attach to a ticket. Documentation that lives next to the logic, evolves with the logic, and runs as the logic. That distinction matters because the institution doesn't need more artifacts. It needs fewer mysteries. A low-code environment often produces a working outcome without producing a readable explanation. A notebook flips that. A notebook forces the logic to exist in a form the organization can inspect. The sequence of steps, the transformations, the assumptions, the error handling, the dependencies, it's all there, in one place, in text, with context. And yes, it's code, but that's not the point. The point is that it is inspectable. Leaders don't buy code, they buy control. They buy the ability to answer boring questions quickly. What changed? Who changed it? Why did the output change? What data did this touch? What rules did we apply? What do we do when input is missing? How do we reproduce the outcome? A notebook is a governance surface because it turns those questions into something the system can answer without heroics. It doesn't replace policy. It makes policy enforceable. It doesn't eliminate risk. It makes risk visible. It doesn't prevent exceptions. It forces exceptions to be expressed as logic, not folklore. And once exceptions are expressed as logic, they can be reviewed, tested, and owned. This is where leadership stops playing defense, because the three risks we just walked through, auditability, lineage, and operational fragility, share one root problem. You cannot govern what you cannot inspect. A notebook is not magic, but it is legible, and legibility changes the economics. When something goes wrong in a notebook-based system, incident response isn't archaeology across scattered visual artifacts. The organization can follow the chain, inputs, transformations, outputs. It can see where the assumptions live. It can see what changed. It can reproduce the run and validate the result. That's not a technical preference. That's an executive capability, because it compresses the time between something is wrong and we know why. And that time is where reputational damage, financial exposure, and compliance risk accumulate. Here's the weird part that most organizations learn late. Speed without explainability is rented. It looks cheap up front because you didn't pay for clarity. But you pay for clarity later as emergency labor, audit prep, incident war rooms, rebuilds, migration archaeology, and governance theater to reassure stakeholders you're on top of it. Notebooks don't make the organization slower. They make the organization safer to change. And at scale, safe change is the only speed that matters. Now, this isn't an argument to replace low code with notebooks everywhere. That would just create a different kind of failure. You'd lose reach. The argument is that mission-critical logic can't live inside an abstraction layer that the institution can't read, because can't read becomes can't move and can't prove and can't safely modify. So notebooks become a boundary. They're the point where the organization stops treating automation like a local convenience and starts treating it like enterprise decision infrastructure. And when notebooks are used that way, leaders get properties they can actually govern. Traceability, decisions have an inspectable pathway. Reproducibility, outcomes can be rerun and validated. Defensibility, audits become evidence, not stories. Portability, logic can be migrated because it's readable. This is the cost truth. You don't pay for code, you pay for ambiguity. Low code doesn't remove ambiguity. It often defers it. Notebooks don't remove ambiguity either, but they force it into the open where it can be managed. And once intent is visible, leadership finally gets to do its job, decide what must be controlled, and enforce that intent by design. That's why notebooks matter. Not because engineers like them, because auditors, incident responders, and strategy shifts punish opacity. And notebooks are the simplest governance mechanism that turns we think into we can prove. Fabric notebooks as the landing zone for mission-critical systems. Now make this practical. Leadership doesn't need a religion war between low-code and notebooks. It needs an escalation model, a graduation path, a place where work that starts as convenience can evolve into something defensible. That's what Fabric notebooks can be, the landing zone for mission-critical execution. Not because Fabric is trendy and not because notebooks are real engineering, because Fabric is one of the few places in the Microsoft ecosystem where notebooks sit inside an enterprise control plane, shared workspaces, governed data in one lake, identity-backed access, version history, scheduling, collaboration, and the ability to treat logic as an asset instead of a personal artifact. That's the real shift, from someone built a thing to the organization owns a system. And this is where the idea of graduation matters. Low code is perfect at the edge. Prototyping, departmental automation, high variation workflows, quick wins, experimentation. It gives you reach. It lets business teams move without waiting for scarce engineering time. But the moment a workflow crosses certain thresholds, it stops being an edge solution. It becomes a core system. And core systems don't get to be opaque. So the escalation model is simple. When the workflow becomes mission critical, it must become inspectable. Mission critical means any of these. It touches authoritative data. It drives financial or regulatory outcomes. It becomes a dependency for other teams. It runs on a schedule that the business relies on. It requires incident response guarantees. It becomes part of your how we operate, not how one team operates. At that point, you don't need more speed. You need controlled speed. This is where Fabric notebooks become the adult table. Fabric gives you a shared platform where notebook-based logic can be treated like governed execution. Changes become reviewable events, not invisible tweaks. History exists, not just in someone's memory. Collaboration is normal, not a handoff nightmare. And scheduling is explicit, not it runs when someone clicks it. That matters for auditability because you can point to a single artifact and say, this is the logic, this is the history, these are the inputs, this is what changed, this is who changed it. That matters for Lineage because the transformations aren't spread across 10 visual surfaces. They're expressed in one place, close to the data, in a form the institution can read. And that matters for operational stability because notebooks force you to acknowledge failure modes as design choices, retrees, idempotency, data quality checks, and the difference between no data and bad data. Nobody gets those things for free, but in notebooks you can at least see whether they exist. Now, the cynical part, every platform promises governance, but governance without a forcing function is just a policy PDF. Fabric's real value here is not that it magically makes people disciplined, it's that it makes the discipline easier to institutionalize, central workspaces, shared artifacts, and a natural place to put logic that must be reviewable. It turns explainability from please document this into this is how the system works. And it gives leadership a clean narrative that isn't about tooling preference. It's about tiers of execution. Tier 1, low code for exploration and reach. Tier 2, notebooks for governed execution and defensible change. Tier 3 eventually is whatever your organization uses for full product engineering and platform services. But most organizations never even formalize Tier 2. They jump from citizen automation to panic engineering during an incident. The landing zone prevents that. It creates a controlled middle where the organization can say, this workflow is important now, so we're moving it to a form we can audit, trace, and operate. And here's the guardrail effect leaders actually want. When the logic lives in a notebook in Fabric, it's harder to just tweak it in the dark. You can still make bad changes, obviously, but the change surface becomes visible. You start building an expectation that important logic has review, history, and ownership. That expectation is what stops drift, because drift isn't a technical issue, it's behavioral entropy. In low-code sprawl, drift is cheap, so you get more of it. In governed execution, drift has friction, so you get fewer invisible changes. And that's the real win. Not that Fabric notebooks are better at running code, but that they make the organization better at owning decisions. Leadership will pay either way. Either it pays now, by enforcing that mission-critical logic must be inspectable, or it pays later by funding archaeology remediation and we can't explain it meetings. Next, the economics, why this isn't just a risk story, but a spend story. The economics of explainability, spend now or pay later. Here's where this stops being a philosophy debate and becomes a finance debate. Most organizations treat low-code as cheaper because they measure the wrong thing. They measure how fast something ships, not how long it stays governable. Speed is visible, governance costs are delayed, and delayed costs are the easiest ones to approve, because nobody labels them as costs. They show up as unplanned work, operational overhead, audit prep, incident response, and we need an extra contractor for a few months. That's not a few months, that's the interest payment on ambiguity. This is the uncomfortable truth. You don't pay for low code with licensing. You pay for low code with organizational attention. Every opaque automation consumes attention later. Someone has to explain it, defend it, fix it, or replace it. The more you scale opaque logic, the more your leadership budget turns into a reaction budget. And there's a specific pattern Fabric exposes in a way leaders can understand. In the Microsoft ecosystem, low-code data tooling often looks cheaper because it reduces the need for specialized skills. But it can cost more to run. And it can cost more to govern because the abstraction layer burns compute and hides intent. That's not a moral judgment, it's a system property. You're paying the platform to interpret your configuration, translate it into execution, and handle edge cases you didn't model. Then you pay again when you need to prove what happened. So the economics of explainability comes down to 3 buckets leaders actually recognize. First, incident economics. When a system breaks and nobody can see the logic clearly, time to diagnosis explodes. And every hour of diagnosis isn't just IT labor, it's business disruption, stalled decisions, escalations, reputational exposure, and leaders pulled into a room to make risk calls with partial information. If the logic is explicit and versioned, diagnosis becomes tracing, not guessing. That is the difference between a contained incident and a week-long war room. Second, audit economics. Audit prep is one of the most predictable costs in enterprise. The surprise is how much of it is self-inflicted. If decision logic is inspectable by design, audit prep becomes collection. If decision logic is scattered, audit prep becomes reconstruction. Reconstruction is expensive because it's manual, political, and often done under deadline. And it gets worse over time because every quarter adds more assets, more exceptions, and more drift. Third, change economics. Organizations always claim they want agility. What they actually need is safe agility. Opaque systems slow change because every change carries unknown blast radius. So teams add process to compensate, extra approvals, extra checks, longer release windows, and freeze periods where nothing can be touched. Those are not governance wins. They are symptoms of missing explainability. In an explainable system, you can move faster precisely because you can see what changed and predict impact. That's the piece most leaders miss. Explainability is not bureaucracy. It's the thing that reduces bureaucracy. Now make it even more concrete. The biggest cost isn't failure. It's hesitation. If teams are afraid to change a system because they can't explain it, the organization gets locked into its own past decisions. And then the business starts making compromises, manual workarounds, parallel processes, and shadow reporting because it's safer than touching the automation. That creates operational drag that never shows up as a single line item. It just shows up as a slower organization. And slow organizations eventually blame their people for what is actually an architectural erosion problem. So when leadership asks for ROI, the answer isn't notebooks are faster or low code is cheaper. The answer is explainability buys confidence. Confidence that systems can be changed without roulette. Confidence that audits can be met without heroics. Confidence that incidents can be diagnosed without archaeology. Confidence that vendor exit is a project, not a crisis. That confidence has direct financial effects. Fewer outages, shorter outages, less rework, less remediation, fewer emergency contractors, and fewer leadership escalations. And yes, there's also a platform economics angle. When you stop paying abstraction tax for everything and start using explicit execution where it matters, you can reduce the compute you burn on convenience. That doesn't mean never use low code. It means don't use it where the cost of ambiguity dwarfs the cost of skill. So here's the decision rule leaders should adopt. Optimize for defensibility and changeability at scale. Because at leadership level, the cost isn't the tool. The cost is the moment you can't explain a decision you're still accountable for. Next, the final piece is not tooling at all. It's the leadership operating model that decides what must be explainable and forces the organization to build that way. The leadership operating model, owning systems at scale. This is where leadership stops pretending governance is a tooling feature. Governance is an operating model. Tools just expose whether you actually have one. So if the organization wants scale without roulette, the operating model has to answer 4 questions explicitly every time an automation crosses from helpful to important. Who owns the outcome? Who owns the logic? Who approves changes? Who accepts risk when something goes wrong? Most organizations only answer the first one. They assign an executive owner for a KPI or a process and assume the rest will sort itself out. It won't, because someone owns the outcome is not the same as someone owns the system that produces the outcome. And the system will always drift toward the lowest friction path. That is the law. So the foundational requirement is ownership clarity, defined at the level auditors and incident responders care about. Ownership of the decision pathway, not just the business result. That means the owner isn't the person who requested the automation. The owner is the person or team accountable for the logic staying correct, reviewable, and changeable over time. If that sounds like IT, good, it should. Not because business teams can't build, but because the institution needs a stable accountability surface. Now, the second part is the decision quality stance. Explainability is non-negotiable for mission-critical logic, not nice to have, not we'll document it later, non-negotiable. Because if leaders allow mission-critical systems to exist without inspectable logic, they are not delegating work, they are delegating risk without visibility. And the platform will happily accept that deal. So the governance law needs to be explicit. Intent must be enforced by design, or entropy wins. Entropy is not a metaphor here. It's the cumulative effect of tiny exceptions, tiny shortcuts, and tiny just this once changes that convert a deterministic security and control model into a probabilistic one. And probabilistic governance always feels fine until the day it matters. Now here's the practical operating model that holds at enterprise scale. Balance reach and control with a graduation path. Low code is your reach layer, notebooks are your control layer, and between them is a threshold that leadership defines and enforces. This isn't about stopping citizen developers, it's about deciding when an asset becomes too important to remain implicit. So define graduation criteria that trigger this must move to governed execution. Criteria like it touches financial reporting, regulated data, or customer impacting decisions. It runs unattended on a schedule that the business relies on. It feeds other automations or becomes a shared dependency. It requires on-call response expectations. It can't be explained end-to-end by someone who wasn't the original builder. That last one is brutal, but it's honest. If only the author can explain it, the institution doesn't own it. Now, once you have graduation criteria, you need a change model that doesn't rely on heroics. This is where notebooks, version history, review, and explicit ownership become the forcing function. Changes become reviewable events, approvals become observable, rollback becomes possible without panic, and the system can produce evidence without assembling a task force. That's the operating model executives are actually buying. Safe change at speed. The cultural correction is simple. and it will upset people who confuse delivery with maturity. Build fast becomes build so we can defend it. Because what leadership defends isn't a tool choice. Leadership defends outcomes. And at scale, outcomes are only defensible when intent is legible and changes are traceable. So the uncomfortable truth leaders need to adopt is this: policy does not scale. Enforced design scales. If the organization doesn't enforce inspectability, ownership, and change control at the architecture level, it will inevitably drift into a state where nobody can explain what's running, but everyone is still accountable for what it does. And that's the exact scenario this episode is trying to prevent. Next, translate this into a 30, 60, 90-day plan that turns we agree into measurable control. 30, 60, 90 days. From visibility to control to measurement. In the first 30 days, leadership buys clarity, not transformation. Inventory the low-code estate that touches core data and core decisions. Flows, apps, data flows, connectors, service accounts, and anything that writes into authoritative stores. Then tag what is business critical, not popular, not widely used, business critical. Then ask one question per asset. Can someone who didn't build it explain it end-to-end with evidence? If the answer is no, you found a governance gap, not a training gap. In the next 60 days, leadership buys control. Define graduation criteria and make them explicit. If a workflow touches regulated data, financial reporting, or becomes a shared dependency, it must move into governed execution. That means inspectable logic, version history, clear ownership, and an approval model that survives vacations and org changes. This is where Fabric notebooks enter as policy enforcement by design, not replacing low code, but absorbing the mission-critical parts into a readable, reviewable form. Also, align ownership. Business owns outcomes. A named platform team owns logic integrity, deployment, and operational risk. Anything else is theater. In the next 90 days, leadership buys measurement. Instrument what you actually pay for today. Failures, rework, time to diagnosis, manual corrections, and audit prep hours. Put baselines on them, then compare before and after governed execution for the assets that graduated. That's the ROI story executives can defend. Fewer surprise incidents, shorter incidents, faster safe change, and less audit panic. And make the policy non-negotiable in one sentence. If it's mission critical, it must be inspectable. That's how you stop buying speed on credit. Explainability is the scalability frontier. Scale without explainability turns governance into probability and leadership into the default risk owner. If you want the practical patterns for graduating low-code into Fabric notebooks without killing momentum, watch the next episode. Subscribe if you're done funding archaeology and ready to fund control.